Now you have learned the concepts of factory overriding and virtual sequence in UVM. Now here I am going to give you a good practice or a good way of developing verification IPs or test benches using UVM with these concepts. These are just four simple points. The first is you should create a base virtual sequence which only has the handles to all the sequences in the environment. And the second point is on always extend from this base virtual sequence to create your own functional sequences, which will create and start the subsequences in the appropriate sequences. And the third point is you should always define a base test class which will start the base virtual sequence in it. So in the base test class, always start the base virtual sequence, and in the functional test or actual test, which is always extending from the base test, you will override the base virtual sequence with the actual sequence you have created for the functionality. So this will be more clear when you see an example in the next slide. So the first step is define a base virtual sequence with all the handles of the sequences. So here your interconnect base virtual sequence is extending from the UVM virtual sequence, and it is containing the handles of all the sequences, that is AXI master sequencer 1 handle and master sequencer 2 handle, and the OCP slave sequencer handle, and its new function and the body function all are empty functions. So this is a base virtual sequence. And the next part is define a base test. So here the base test name is interconnect base test, which is extending from the UVM test. And in the interconnect base test, again you will have the handle of the base virtual sequence that we have already defined here. So this is interconnect base virtual sequence, so V sequence handle. And you can see that in the build phase function there's a slight difference compared to the previous slide. So after the super.build phase function, before creating the environment and the sequence, you should call a function called set factory override. So this function is a virtual function in the base test. So again, this is a user defined function. So you should add this function as a virtual function in the test. You can give any name, but this is a recommended name, set factory override. And you should always keep this base factory override function as an empty function. So in the build phase function, before creating the environment and the virtual sequence, you will be calling a set factory override function, which is an empty virtual function in the base test. And next, in the run phase function, after raising the objection, you will call the init virtual sequence function, which will fill the handles appropriately, like the v sequence h handle dot the master sequencer is equal to the environment dot master agent 1 dot sequencer, and so on. And after that we will be starting the base virtual sequence on the null pointer, and when it is finished we will drop the objection. As there is no content with the body function of the base virtual sequence, so nothing will happen here if you just start this base test in the simulation. Now the next step is define your own functional sequences and tests from these two base classes. Now you are going to define a functional sequence which will start three different child sequences, which are two AXI sequence and one OCP sequence, which we had seen in the previous example session. So your simple sequence, AXI OCP simple sequence, which is extending from the base virtual sequence we had defined in the previous slide, and there you are declaring three different sequences, like two AXI sequences and one OCP sequence. And in the body method, what you're going to do is you will be creating these sequences and you'll be starting them in the respective sequences. You can see that AXI sequence 1 is started on the AXI master sequencer 1 handle. So this AXI master sequencer 1 handle is defined in the previous base class, which is the interconnect base env virtual sequence. As we are extending this class from this base class, this handle is available here. Now coming to the test part, your own functional test, which is extending from the base functional test we had defined. And if you look at the functional test content, it is a very simple test content where you just wanted to override the virtual sequence handle in the base test with the new sequence that you had created here. So this is done in the set factory override function, which we had again defined in the base class. So if your functional test will be looking this, which is extending from the base test class, and you are just filling the function with the virtual function which is set factory override with the appropriate statements. There we are asking to override the interconnect base virtual sequence type with the new virtual sequence that you have created here. So now we'll go back to the previous slide to see what will actually happen. So in this test, which is extending from the base test, we are overriding the inbuilt type of the base virtual sequence with the new virtual sequence we have created here. So here, before the build phase function, we are calling an empty function in the base test, which is set factory override, and that particular function was filled in the new test. So again, the extended test have all the properties of the base test. So when its build phase function is called, it will call the supernode build phase function, and again it will call the set factory override function, which is nothing but overriding the interconnect base virtual sequence type to the new virtual sequence we have created here. Thus, this virtual sequence handle will be effectively of type the new sequence that you have created, and where when you start the virtual sequence, actually you'll be starting the body of this new sequence you have created, and all the child sequences will be started. You might be thinking this is all our unwanted hierarchical creation, but the real advantage is that this is more modular and more reusable. So once you have created your own base virtual sequence and base test, you will be creating multiple sequences which will be doing different functionality into the environment, and you will start them in a different test. So all your tests will be very simple, which will be just overriding the types which are just containing 3-4 lines. And also imagine a situation like you are developing verification IPs, where you are defining a set of standards and a set of base classes, and multiple people are using them. There, the role of the end users are reduced, so they just need to define their own sequences, and their test writing job is also reduced. They just need to override the based virtual sequence to the new sequence that they have created. I hope you understood these concepts clearly. It could be a little confusing for you, but if you go through the same session again, I'm sure that you will be understanding this in detail.